All right, good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I am Joe Casey, President and CEO of Sturdy Memorial Hospital, and I would like to welcome you to our COVID-19 vaccine virtual town hall. This meeting will be led by Dr. Antonella Fine, our infectious diseases specialist and physician director of infection control, and Dr. Brian Patel, Chief of Emergency Services and Associate Chief Quality Officer, both of whom have played critical roles in our COVID-19 response. Through their leadership, dedication, and guidance, along with the commitment of every member of the Sturdy organization, we have been able to appropriately care for our patients as safely as possible during these unprecedented times. If you have any questions during the presentations of both Dr. Fine and Dr. Patel, please use the chat box and they will, at the end of the presentation, answer those questions. So right now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fine to begin the presentation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, Sturdy community. So I thought we would begin this evening by really getting on the same page about where we are in this pandemic. So give us a moment just to share our screen so you can see the slides. All right, so we'll start off first by gauging where we've been, where we are, and where we might go. We can start with the next slide. So right now, we are seeing as many as 300,000 new cases per day of COVID-19, and we have had more than 25.5 million total cases in the United States. More than 425,000 people have died of COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic in the US. In Massachusetts, we've had 506,000 total cases and over 14,000 lives lost. In worldwide, we've seen more than 100 million infections and more than 2.16 million deaths. While the US makes up about 4% of the world population, we have comprised about 25% of cases and 20% of deaths seen from COVID-19. Now, if you see this graph, you might think that that drop for the last few weeks in January is a really wonderful sign, and it could be, but I want to explain it a little bit more. Think back to where we were in April and how terrifying that was, and then what has happened ever since then, with the most terrifying times of all having been in early January. There are a lot of reasons for what we saw in the beginning of January and what we're seeing right now that I'd want to just take a brief moment to explain. Between January 8th and now, over the past few weeks, there's been about a 35% drop in cases from our peak of 300,000 new infections per day to now about 155,000 new infections per day in the US, while deaths have stabilized at about 3,000 to 4,000 per day. Thoughts on why this present drop might be are because there has been more social distancing after the holidays, which increased transmission of the virus. People are traveling less over the past few weeks, and because they anticipate that vaccines are now on the horizon, they might be taking more steps to protect themselves by socially distancing and wearing masks, because it would be a shame to get COVID-19 right when it's your turn to be able to get a vaccine to protect you. Now, more than 24 million Americans have received a COVID-19 vaccine, and we're currently vaccinating about 1 million people per day in the United States, and we're likely starting to see the impact of that in terms of immunity. Next slide, please. For the pandemic to end, we need at least 70% of the United States population to be immune from previous infection or vaccination. From what we know so far about infection, people are protected from getting reinfected or a second case of infection for about 3 months. But after that, they may get COVID-19 again. And as we see new variants, new genetic variants pop up, that may be even more common, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So far, an estimated 7 to 15% of the United States population has been infected with COVID-19. And in order to get to that 70%, we would see a tremendous amount of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. And that's precisely what we're trying to avoid through vaccination. Vaccination offers us an opportunity to prevent a tremendous burden on our lives, on our families, on our communities, on our healthcare infrastructure, and on our economy too. But most importantly, vaccines, and the two that we'll be talking about tonight, are safe and effective. And they're a key component to help us end this pandemic without the burden of COVID-19 infection on ourselves and our communities. I just wanted to point out one thing, because I know that people have thought a lot about herd immunity and thinking that, well, if I'm of a younger age or I don't have many comorbid medical conditions, I'm considered a low-risk person. Perhaps it's less worrisome for me to just get infected with COVID-19 rather than accept a vaccine that seems relatively new to me or that I don't feel that I know enough about. But the problem with that thinking is that COVID-19 infection really doesn't care so much about one's age or one's medical conditions. And we've seen many people get tremendously ill and even die when they're young and when they don't have other high-risk conditions. Not only that, we've also seen that people can develop something called long COVID, which is that they may have really lasting and debilitating symptoms for many months after infection, even if their initial infection was mild. In fact, 87% of patients who are hospitalized for COVID-19 have at least one persistent symptom 2 months after infection, and 75% of them have at least one symptom 6 months after infection. 1 in 5 patients that didn't require supplemental oxygen during hospitalization have decreased lung function after 6 months. And approximately 50% of patients with mild COVID-19 that never required hospitalization have persistent symptoms after 4 months, and more than 30% have neurologic symptoms 6 months after infection. And the most common of these are extreme fatigue, especially exertional fatigue, shortness of breath, joint pain, chest pain, cough, loss of smell, brain fog, and headache. So we're trying to prevent that through vaccination, and I'll explain how these vaccines have been tested. Next slide, please. So under normal circumstances, and under these circumstances, vaccines go through clinical trials in the following way. The Food and Drug Administration oversees clinical trials to ensure that they are safe and that they're effective. So in phase 1, we only see about 20 to 100 healthy volunteers be tested for the vaccine to make sure that it's safe and that it appears to work and it warrants further study. And once phase 1 has been successfully and safely completed, then the vaccine will move to phase 2, where several hundred volunteers are tested for the vaccine. The more people that are tested for the vaccine, the more we can see rare complications. And that's most important in phase 3. So no vaccine can move or jump phases. They have to go through and demonstrate safety and efficacy for each individual phase before they can move on to the next. And in phase 3 clinical trials, that's where we see hundreds to thousands and tens of thousands of volunteers to make sure that the vaccine is safe and effective. And then the vaccine's approved. And once it's approved, there's post-approval surveillance, which is considered to be phase 4. So that's where we are right now with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that we'll discuss in detail this evening. In phase 4, we can see extremely rare complications that might be seen as a result of the vaccine. And I'll explain how we're actually doing quite well with these two and want to give you every opportunity to ask your questions at the end of the talk. Next slide, please. So in the normal vaccine life cycle, there's a lot of work that is done before a vaccine can even make it to phase 1. I just wanted to include this slide so everybody can see the rigorous study that goes into a vaccine's approval process. So there's basic research and discovery. There are trials that are used, what we call in vitro studies, that are in the scientific bench, that are then replicated in animal studies. And only after we've seen a promising candidate does it move to human clinical trials in those phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies that we mentioned in the slide previously. After FDA review and ACIP, which is the division that approves vaccines of the CDC, we then have released into the public only when the vaccine is deemed to be safe and effective, and then there's that phase 4, which is the post-approval monitoring and ongoing research. Now, some traditional vaccines use live, weakened, or inactivated virus, or just a critical piece of the virus protein coat, and they work. Polio and measles are just 2 examples of serious illnesses brought under control by vaccines. And collectively, vaccines have done more good for humanity than really any other medical advance in history. But growing large amounts of a virus and then weakening the virus or extracting a critical piece takes a lot of time. In contrast, within weeks of determination of the genetic sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, mRNA technology was used to create a vaccine against the virus' outer spike protein that, coupled with an unprecedented number of infections occurring simultaneously worldwide and unprecedented funding, permitted clinical trials to be completed safely without cutting any corners or skipping any steps in record time. So while it feels that these vaccines have come out so fast, and in fact they have, because to date, before COVID-19 vaccines, fastest vaccine approval took 4 years, these are the reasons why these vaccines have been found to be safe and effective in such a quick amount of time, because the mRNA technology allowed us to do this very safely, and the sheer number of people with SARS-CoV-2 infection, COVID-19, allowed us to test tens of thousands of people in a very, in a shorter amount of time than we have normally seen with other vaccines. Next slide, please. So how does the mRNA vaccine work? And Pfizer and Moderna are both examples of mRNA vaccines. So when you see this slide, I want you to keep both of these in mind. Now, scientists take a part of the virus's genetic code and turn it into a vaccine that's injected to the patient. So for mRNA vaccines, this is the genetic material that is not coming from the virus itself. It just encodes a protein that is on the outside of the virus. So I'll speak in a little bit about how this vaccine contains no component, no actual part of virus at all. It's just trying to teach our bodies how to make that protein so that our bodies can recognize the protein as foreign and create antibodies and stimulate an immune response in reaction to it, so that when we encounter the real SARS-CoV-2 virus in the future, through transmission from somebody else who might be infected, our immune system is already ready and primed to mount a response and prevent us from getting symptomatic infection. So the vaccine enters the cells where it is injected in the arm, and that mRNA, which is covered and protected by what we call lipid nanoparticle, really just kind of fat molecules to keep it from getting immediately degraded upon entry into the tissues, taken up into the cells in the arm, and then it is translated into a protein, that spike protein. So it never actually enters our cell nucleus. It never encounters our own genome. The mRNA, right after it's used to create that protein, is immediately degraded, and that spike protein is then presented on the outer surface of the cell that was used to make it, and our immune system recognizes it as foreign and creates antibodies against it. So compared to traditional vaccines, mRNA vaccines can actually generate a much stronger type of immunity by stimulating the immune system to make antibodies and immune system killer cells, which are a double strike at the virus. Next slide, please. Now, there are many benefits of mRNA vaccines, including the ones that I mentioned already. So the technology has actually been around for decades, about 30 years to be exact, and it's performed safely in clinical trials and in vitro studies using other infections like influenza, Zika, rabies, CMV, HIV, hepatitis C, and Ebola, and also cancer research, but never previously had the funding or support for large trials until now. COVID-19 vaccines are being held to the same safety standards as all other vaccines that have been approved in the United States and have been rigorously tested, as we mentioned, for safety and efficacy before being authorized for use here. The vaccines contain no virus, only the lab-created mRNA, that genetic material, and covered by the lipid nanoparticle that stabilizes it. There are a couple of other vaccines in the pipeline right now that I won't get into detail just yet because they have not been submitted for FDA approval yet. It is unclear when or if they'll be available, but AstraZeneca, Oxford vaccine, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, I'll just mention quickly, are both containing non-replicating viral vector, which is an adenovirus that contains DNA, unlike mRNA, in a one-dose vaccine. But thus far, they do not appear to be quite as effective as the Pfizer and the Moderna mRNA vaccines, but more is to be learned about these. So I don't want to be premature in getting into too much detail about them. Next slide, please. So in terms of the safety, these vaccines are relatively lower cost, easy, and quick to manufacture. And because what we're doing really is just using a genetic sequence and encapsulating it in this lipid nanoparticle and injecting it directly in the body, we can really adjust the process as needed based on emergence of genetic variants. So there's a lot of concern right now about genetic mutations that have emerged that alter the spike protein. Namely, there's the B117 UK variant that's now been detected in 27 states in the United States, including Massachusetts, and also thought to be 50% more infectious and possibly 30 to 40% more deadly than the present circulating SARS-CoV-2 strain. There's also the South African variant that has been detected in South Carolina, and the Brazil variant in Minnesota, and the Southern California variant that was detected in about 1/3 of patients in Los Angeles. Now, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines still show efficacy against these variants, but they might be less protective and or require extra doses. We need to learn a lot more about this. Thus far, there's no evidence that these vaccines would not be effective against any of the variants that have been detected thus far. Monoclonal antibody therapy, however, might not be as effective against these variants, and more study is ongoing. Now, the two mRNA vaccines that we're discussing induce high levels of neutralizing antibodies in addition to these killer T cells that we mentioned that will remember and quickly attack the virus if it sees it again. So together, this really may be sufficient protection even without a booster dose. But as I said, we need to learn more about it. Now, herd immunity from natural infection appears to last about 3 months, but the emergence of variants may make natural herd immunity unlikely, and vaccination really our best hope at ending this pandemic. So as I said before, the mRNA that's injected in the vaccines does not enter the cell nucleus or interact with your genome at all. Therefore, it cannot alter your DNA and is rapidly degraded by cellular processes. Vaccines only encode the spike protein, not the whole virus, which means there's no way to get COVID-19 infection from the vaccine itself. The spike protein is broken down within days to weeks, like other proteins in the body as well. Next slide, please. Now, the efficacy that has been seen from these two vaccines are as follows. So these were large trials. There were 44,000 patients randomly assigned to receive either 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine or placebo, and 30,420 patients randomly assigned to receive either 2 doses of the Moderna vaccine or placebo. Pfizer teamed up with a German company, BioNTech, and Moderna is a local company actually right out of Massachusetts. The Pfizer vaccine demonstrated an overall 95% efficacy, and Moderna vaccine demonstrated an overall 94.1% efficacy in preventing symptomatic COVID-19 infection compared to placebo. This is actually revolutionary. I know that people might say, well, it's not 100%, but just to put things in perspective, the seasonal influenza vaccine, which is still very important and can prevent severe influenza and hospitalization and death, it's much better at letting the flu be a nuisance rather than a killer for us. And still a great idea to get your flu shot. But in perspective, the influenza vaccine is probably about 40% protective, whereas this vaccine is 95% protective. We actually have not seen many vaccines in history that are this effective. Both vaccines performed equally well in persons of different races, ethnicities, and medical conditions representative of the diversity and health of the United States population. The Pfizer vaccine had equal efficacy across all age groups. The Moderna vaccine was 95.6% efficacious between ages 18 and 64 and 86.4% efficacious for age 65 and older. Next slide, please. We're still learning about the long-term efficacy of these vaccines, but they're likely to be protected for a minimum of 4 months and maybe even upwards of a year because of the extremely high levels of neutralizing antibodies that they trigger for production. Both vaccines are at least 50% effective 1 to 2 weeks after the first dose, and full efficacy is achieved 1 to 2 weeks after the second dose, which is why it is absolutely recommended that you get both doses. And currently it's recommended that you receive 2 doses of the same vaccine rather than interchangeably. Next slide, please. Now, what is in the vaccine? So as we mentioned for Pfizer and Moderna, they both contain the mRNA encoding the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, and they both contain lipids that contain and stabilize the mRNA and prevent it from being degraded and so that it can make its way into our cells and be turned into the spike protein. The Pfizer vaccine is 2 doses, 21 days apart, and the Moderna vaccine is 2 doses, 28 days apart. Neither of these vaccines contains any preservatives or adjuvants. There are other minor components in these vaccines that you can see listed here. And the only reason it's worth mentioning is because if you have a known allergy to any of the components of these vaccines, it is not recommended you get it. But truly, that's the only contraindication, and Dr. Patel will talk about that more. Next slide, please. Over 70 million people in the world have now received a COVID-19 vaccine, and more than 24 million in the US alone. There have been no deaths due to COVID-19 vaccination. There have been no cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, transverse myelitis, or autoimmune disorders attributed either to COVID-19 infection or vaccination. And while Bell's palsy has been reported in both vaccine and placebo groups, this occurred in equal incidence observed in the general population and thus not due to the vaccine. Next slide, please. The incidence of severe allergic reactions, for example, anaphylaxis to a COVID-19 vaccine, is 1 in 200,000, which is far lower than the incidence of anaphylaxis to food and penicillin, which is about 1 in 2,500. Although the media really scrutinizing all of these cases might make us feel that they're more common, I just wanted to make sure that everybody has this in perspective, because it's an important point that while we hear about anything that might be attributed to this vaccine because it's so new, really anaphylaxis is much more rare than initial reports made us believe that it was. Anaphylaxis typically occurs within minutes to an hour, and severe reactions to vaccines occur within days or weeks of administration. So it's extremely unlikely that anyone would have a very late reaction to this vaccine. All adverse outcomes related to COVID-19 vaccination are reported to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System called VAERS. So as we are continuing to monitor these vaccines' safety in this phase 4 study, all of your providers will be paying close attention to any potential adverse outcomes from vaccinations so that we can report it immediately and everyone can be aware of a new finding if one occurs. Next slide, please. Now, the potential side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine have some overlap with COVID-19 infection itself, so it's important to make this distinction. Fever, chills, fatigue, muscle aches, joint aches, headache, nausea, and local injection site redness, swelling or pain, and swollen lymph nodes have all been described as side effects to COVID-19 vaccination. The most common symptoms, as you can see by the percentages there, are fatigue, body aches, and local injection site discomfort. These are transient. They usually last only about a couple of days and should not last more than 3 days, with day 1 being the first day of vaccination. Now, what we do not see as potential side effects from the vaccination are vomiting, diarrhea, loss of taste or smell, sore throat, congestion, runny nose, shortness of breath, or cough, which are seen with COVID-19 infection. So those are symptoms that if they occur should really raise suspicion that perhaps a vaccinated individual was exposed to COVID-19 infection, which is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, before they got their vaccine, and they should be isolated and tested for COVID-19 infection. So if you are vaccinated and you have symptoms that last beyond 3 days after your vaccination, or you have any of these other kind of red flag symptoms that I mentioned, which are more commonly seen with COVID-19 infection itself, as in the cough, shortness of breath, runny nose, sore throat, loss of taste or smell, vomiting, or diarrhea, you should be contacting your healthcare provider to determine if COVID-19 infection should be performed or what other cause might be responsible for those symptoms. I do want to also point out that vaccination cannot cause COVID-19 infection. So because COVID-19 is widely circulating in our community, it is certainly possible for someone to be exposed to the virus right around the time that they're receiving the vaccine and have it become symptomatic after they were vaccinated. Next slide, please. I wanted to briefly mention the importance of race and ethnicity with COVID-19 infection. People of color in the United States have shared a disproportionate burden of COVID-19 infections, hospitalization, and death. Race and ethnicity are risk markers for other underlying conditions that impact health, including socioeconomic status, access to healthcare, and increased exposure to the virus due to occupation, namely frontline, essential, and critical infrastructure workers. So these are some of the reasons why we might be seeing between a 1.2 and a 4.0 time increase in hospitalization rates and a 0.6 to 1.8 times increase in the number of cases in people of color. But what is most worrisome is the increase in the risk of death. For all interested, filmmaker Tyler Perry is airing a documentary tonight at 9 p.m. on BET called COVID-19 Vaccine and the Black Community. Next slide, please. Black and Latinx adults are the most likely to desire to wait and see before getting a COVID-19 vaccine. And this is likely rooted in a distrust of medicine stemming from past racist and sometimes dangerous health policies and clinical experiments that targeted particularly vulnerable Black and Brown communities. Our hope is that everyone, but particularly people of color who are disproportionately impacted by this virus, feel comfortable asking questions to allow for an informed decision about accepting these safe and effective vaccines. And for now, I will move on. I'll turn this over to Dr. Patel, who will do the remainder of the slides, and the two of us will be available for questions after the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fine, and thanks for that great presentation on the clinical background related to the vaccinations. I'm going to take a few minutes now to talk about some of the logistics around the vaccination, talk a little bit about who can get the vaccination, what are indications, contraindications to the vaccination, and in the end, talk a little bit about the phases in Massachusetts and where and when you are able to get vaccinated against COVID-19. So indications for getting the vaccine are a little bit different for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. For Pfizer, anybody over the age of 16 is eligible for the vaccine, but for Moderna is over the age of 18. And that reason is solely because of the way the studies were done in Pfizer and Moderna, so that for Moderna, they tested only in people over the age of 18, whereas in Pfizer, they went down to the age of 16. COVID-19 vaccination in the country, in Massachusetts and in the country, is provided free of charge. So there will be no cost to any patients who do want to get vaccinated, as the goal here is to really get as many people vaccinated in this country as possible and hopefully achieve herd immunity as soon as we possibly can, with 70% of the population getting vaccinated. The important thing to note here is there is only one major contraindication to getting the vaccine, which is anyone who has had a severe allergic reaction or immediate allergic reaction to any component of the COVID-19 vaccine or to a previous dose of mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. That is the only absolute contraindication. There may be some precautions, which I'll discuss in a minute below, but these are not absolute contraindications. People who have a history of anaphylactic reactions to any other vaccine besides the COVID-19 vaccine or to injectable therapies, IM antibiotics, intravenous antibiotics, or other injectable medications, are still able to get the COVID-19 vaccine, but may want to do that with caution and have a discussion with their primary care doctor or other provider before making a decision about getting the vaccine. But they are still able to get the vaccine, and in those situations where those patients do get vaccination, they would be monitored for a longer period of time after they receive the vaccine. It is important to note that you should not receive the COVID-19 vaccine within 14 days before or after receiving another vaccine. So if you received one vaccine, you should wait at least 14 days before receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. Next slide, please. The administration of the COVID-19 vaccine in pregnancy and breastfeeding women has definitely been a point of question for many people in the country. The studies had very limited data on that COVID-19 vaccination in pregnant or lactating women. There were a few women who were pregnant in both studies, and there were no adverse pregnancy outcomes observed in 11 pregnant women who received the Pfizer vaccine and 6 pregnant women who received the Moderna vaccine in clinical trials. CDC and ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, do not consider pregnancy or breastfeeding contraindications to the COVID-19 vaccination. However, I know that the WHO, the World Health Organization, has recently put out a statement that states, while pregnancy puts women at higher risk of severe COVID-19, the use of this vaccine in pregnant women is currently not recommended unless they are at risk of high exposure, as examples, healthcare workers or other frontline or essential workers. I want to just make a point that the reason they put the statement out is not because of concern for vaccine in women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, but because of lack of data surrounding the use of the vaccine in pregnant women. And those studies are currently in progress and ongoing, but that the CDC and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology do recommend vaccination of individuals who are eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine and are at high risk for developing severe COVID-19. And the recommendation right now is that there should be a discussion with their OBGYN or primary care doctor if there's questions in pregnant women related to getting the COVID-19 vaccine, but that we do recommend strong consideration of being vaccinated in this population. Next slide. For those people who've had current or recent history of COVID-19, you should not get the vaccine until you have improved or if you have completed your period of isolation. So if you've been diagnosed with COVID-19, you should remain in isolation at least for 10 days from the onset of symptoms or positive COVID test if you're asymptomatic, have been fever-free for 24 hours and have improving symptoms. After that time period when your isolation has ended, you are eligible to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, and there's no required time between when you are recovering from illness and when you receive vaccination. One thing that is important to consider, however, is that if you've had monoclonal antibody therapy or convalescent plasma therapy, you do need to wait at least 90 days before receiving COVID-19 vaccine. Reinfection is uncommon in the 90 days after initial infection. We do believe that there is immunity up to at least 90 days after you've suffered COVID-19. And so if you choose to delay vaccination, you can choose to wait until after the 90-day period if you choose to do so. Next slide, please. For those who have been exposed to COVID-19 and require quarantine due to exposure, they should defer vaccination until the quarantine period has ended so as to avoid exposing healthcare personnel or other persons during the vaccination visit, and also to avoid confusion as to whether your symptom development is due to COVID-19 infection or vaccination itself. So it's important to wait until after you finish your quarantine period before you schedule your vaccine appointment. Next slide. For individuals with underlying medical conditions, the vaccine can be administered as long as you have no other contraindications to the vaccine. And again, remember, the only contraindication is a history of severe anaphylaxis to any component of the vaccine or a history of severe allergic reaction to when you receive your first dose of the vaccine. Immunocompromised persons also have no contraindication to receiving the vaccine. They may have a slightly diminished response to the vaccination, but there is no contraindication. And again, a discussion with that person's healthcare provider can help make an informed decision related to the risks of COVID-19 infection versus the potential risks of vaccination. Next slide. This slide just summarizes the indications and contraindications to receiving the vaccine. So again, as I mentioned in the previous slides, patients with immunocompromising conditions, autoimmune disease, pregnancy, women who are breastfeeding, patients who are on anticoagulation therapy or coagulopathies can receive the vaccination without any issue. If you had a history of food, pet, insect, venom, environmental allergies, that is not a contraindication to receiving the vaccination. Any history of allergy to oral medications is not a contraindication. So this includes oral equivalents to injectable medications. For example, if you take an oral version of an antibiotic that you can receive IV, having an allergy to the oral medication does not result in a contraindication to receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. If you've had non-severe allergy to vaccination or other injectables, that also is not a contraindication. So if you've had mild side effects to the flu vaccine, for example, that is not a contraindication to getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And a family history of severe allergic reaction or anaphylaxis is also not a contraindication to receiving the COVID-19 vaccination. As I mentioned, also a history of severe allergic reaction to another vaccine or an injectable medication, you should you're still able to get the vaccine, but just do so with caution, and you should have a longer period of monitoring after you do receive the vaccine. And then the only contraindication to vaccination is a severe allergic reaction to any component of the vaccine itself. Next slide. So as Dr. Fine had mentioned earlier, Typically, severe allergic reactions, if they are going to occur with COVID-19 vaccine, will occur within a few minutes to 1 hour after vaccination. And symptoms that you commonly develop with severe allergic reaction include things such as difficulty breathing, swelling of your face or throat, a fast heartbeat, a bad rash all over your body, or dizziness and weakness. No matter where you get the COVID-19 vaccine, no matter which clinic it is, they will have equipment available or processes in place to be able to address if you do develop severe allergic reaction after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. And there is a minimum of a 15-minute monitoring period that occurs after you receive the vaccine at the location that you receive it to be able to monitor for any development of these symptoms. If you develop any of these symptoms after you go home or after your 15-minute post-vaccination monitoring period, you should call 911 or go to your local emergency department for evaluation. Your medical provider, you should also report if you do get a serious allergic reaction such as this and you end up in an emergency department, you should make sure your provider or whoever you received your vaccine from is aware that this happened so that they can report it to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. And if you do develop a severe allergic reaction to your COVID-19 vaccine, you should not receive any further doses of the vaccine. Next slide. So what should you do after receiving the vaccine? There is a website that is offered to every person who receives the vaccine called vSafe that you likely will receive information on when you do receive your COVID-19 vaccine. It is dependent on what clinic you go to receive your vaccine, but you are able to receive a text message from vSafe that will allow you to report any side effects on a daily basis. And this is important to really log into the system and utilize it because it provides important information to the CDC as to the volume of side effects that are occurring related to the vaccination, and is important in this phase 4 monitoring period that we're in currently in the vaccine development process. And so you will receive a daily text message to check in for the first 7 days after your injection, and then once a week for the next 4 weeks to check in and see how you're doing after you receive your vaccine. It is important to remember that despite getting the vaccine, all of the infection control and social distancing measures that we currently participate in, you are going to need to continue to do. So you'll need to continue to mask when you're in public, maintain social distancing whenever possible, avoid large crowds, maintain good hand hygiene. And the reason for this is that we are currently in the process of getting to herd immunity. So there is still always risk of infection and spread of infection. As many of you probably know, there's a not insignificant incidence of asymptomatic COVID-19 and asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19. And it still remains to be seen in those people that have been vaccinated, whether they still can potentially transmit COVID-19 in an asymptomatic fashion. And so you want to try to prevent and reduce your risk of carrying COVID-19 virus as much as possible by continuing these infection control measures. It's also important to note that for the time being, the travel guidelines that have been put in place by the state of Massachusetts will continue. And so that we will need to follow those guidelines in terms of getting tested when you return from travel outside of Massachusetts and following the quarantine guidelines as recommended by the state of Massachusetts. And when that changes will be up to the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts as to when that will be modified. You do not have to quarantine before or after receiving the vaccine, but you must continue to follow quarantine guidance if you get exposed to someone with COVID-19, even after you've been vaccinated, for the reason that I mentioned before, due to the risk of potential asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19. Again, to reiterate, as Dr. Fine had mentioned earlier, COVID-19 vaccination does not cause a positive COVID-19 PCR antigen test. So if you do get a positive COVID test after you received vaccination, that is indicative of COVID-19 infection and is not a result of the vaccine itself. We don't commonly do antibody testing, but the vaccine may cause a positive antibody test, as the purpose of the vaccine is to generate antibodies in your body to fight COVID-19. Next slide. So the next part of the presentation I just want to spend a few minutes on is when and where you can get your COVID-19 vaccine in Massachusetts. So as many of you may be familiar with, Massachusetts has divided distribution of the vaccine into 3 phases. We are currently completing phase 1 right now, which includes the 6 categories that you see here, including clinical and non-clinical healthcare workers, long-term care facilities, first responders, congregate care settings, home-based healthcare workers, and healthcare workers doing non-COVID facing care. Beginning February 1st, which is Monday, we will be moving to phase 2, which will begin with vaccination of individuals who are 75 years and older. And then after a period of time, we'll move to individuals who are 65 years and older, or individuals with two or more comorbidities. And then early education and K through 12 workers, transit, grocery, utility, food and agriculture, sanitation, public work and public health workers, and then individuals with one comorbidity. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what a comorbidity is so that you better understand which category you fall into. It's important to understand why the numbers of 75 and 65 were decided upon in phase 2. When you look at the risk of severe COVID-19 in the population and the volume of, or the type of person that is dying from COVID-19, it is disproportionately the older population that is dying from COVID-19. Patients 65 years and older make up only 14.3% of COVID-19 infections. However, they make up over 80% of the COVID-19 deaths. So while the older population is not necessarily getting as much infected with COVID-19 as often, likely because they're being more careful, maintaining social isolation and social distancing, when they do get COVID-19, the risk of death is significantly higher. And the risk is even higher in the population of 75 and older. So of that 80% who die, 59% of them are over the age of 75, which is why the top priority has been to vaccinate in phase 2 individuals 75 years and older, and then moving down to 65 years and older. And then understandably, given the risk of frontline work that early education, K through 12 workers and all of the other people in the categories in phase 2 work in, they're moved into phase 2 as well for vaccination. And that we anticipate in Massachusetts that vaccination for this population in phase 2 will occur between February and April. It has not been completely determined when we will move into the second part of phase 2, which is individuals 65 years and older. That still has not been announced by the state of Massachusetts. And then we anticipate that phase 3, which is vaccines available to the general public or anybody else that did not fall into phase 1 and phase 2, will occur sometime in the April to June timeframe. Next slide. So when thinking about whether you fall into which category you fall into, when we talk about the comorbidities that are listed in phase 2, these are some of the conditions that increase your risk of severe COVID-19 infection and are considered comorbidities that would put you into a specific category. So obviously we talked about age already, being 65 and older, having a history of cancer or current cancer, history of cardiovascular disease, including heart failure, coronary artery disease, or prior myocardial infarction, cardiomyopathy, chronic kidney disease, type 2 diabetes, COPD or emphysema, Down syndrome, obesity, so having a body mass index greater than 30. Pregnancy is considered increased risk for severe COVID-19 infection, which is also why we do recommend vaccination in that population. Sickle cell disease, smoking, and solid organ transplant. Next slide, please. Other diseases that may increase the risk of severe COVID-19 and would still fall under the categories of comorbidities include asthma, cerebrovascular disease or stroke, cystic fibrosis, immunocompromised states from bone marrow transplant, immune deficiencies, HIV, use of steroid medications or other immune weakening medicines, hypertension, liver disease, neurologic conditions such as dementia, being overweight, so having a BMI greater than 25 but less than 30, having a history of pulmonary fibrosis, thalassemia, which is a blood disorder, or type 1 diabetes. Next slide, please. So when can you get your vaccine? As I mentioned previously, vaccination for patients 75 years and older will begin on Monday, February 1st. Appointments have already been opened up in all the clinics in Massachusetts to start making appointments for February 21st, and they opened up yesterday. I'm sure many of you have already tried to get your vaccine appointments. They're opening them up on a daily and rolling basis based on vaccine availability. So there are limited amounts of vaccine currently in the state of Massachusetts. And so that's why they're opening up appointments as they know vaccine is available, so that they're not having people sign up for appointments and then find out that they're not able to get the vaccine because there's not any available. Next slide. So where can you get your vaccine? In the Sturdy community, we are making plans to be able to offer vaccine for Sturdy patients through the office practices, either at the practice itself or at a centralized location where patients will be able to come to get the vaccine. This is all dependent on on Sturdy Memorial Associates getting vaccine allotted to them, which we have not yet gotten vaccine allotted for patients yet. Similarly, at the hospital, we will also be planning on doing a community vaccine clinic at the hospital as well, once we are provided vaccine to be able to distribute. And when we do get this vaccine, information will be distributed out to the public and our patients. But we do not have a time frame set up for those clinics as of yet, but we'll make sure that we notify people as soon as we do. In the meantime, until we do have these clinics available, you can go to the website located below to find locations within Massachusetts that do have clinic appointments available. You will have to, the websites fill up quickly, the appointments fill up quickly, so you may have to check several times and check back frequently to see when vaccine appointments open up to be able to get your appointment. And when you sign up on those websites, they will tell you when and where to show up for your appointment. They'll give you information on what you need to bring to your appointment to be prepared for the appointment itself. And those websites should also discuss how they will do scheduling for your booster vaccine in either 3 or 4 weeks, depending on whether you get the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. Next slide. So that is the end of our presentation. I think we're going to take some questions now for Dr. Fine and myself.
Yes, we've received a few questions on our chat feature. We encourage you to use the chat feature to ask your questions at this point in time. We're going to stop the screen share and open up that chat feature. Okay, so one of the first questions that we have, Dr. Patel and Dr. Fine, is will the potential side effects of the vaccine be worse for someone who is already immune compromised because they are on chemo and have comorbidities?
So Dr. Patel, I can take that one if that's all right. So that's a great question. In fact, the concern about immune compromised individuals is that they actually might have a reduced response to the vaccine because they are on medications that weaken their immune reaction in order to battle another medical condition. So we don't yet know much about immune compromised persons because they were not studied in these 2 clinical trials. But right now, the recommendation is that if someone qualifies for vaccination based on being in one of those risk category groups that Dr. Patel spoke about, that they have a discussion with their healthcare provider about their risks of exposure and their risk of severe COVID-19 infection or death, and whether or not it's worth them getting the vaccine now before trials have been performed in immune compromised hosts. But to answer the question about side effects that one might anticipate, there's no evidence thus far and there's no evidence to suggest that people who have immune compromising conditions will have more severe side effects. There has been some concern that people who have a previous history of COVID-19 infection might have increased side effects because their body has already seen and responded to the spike protein before through natural infection and might already be primed with antibodies and those killer T cells to react quickly if they see the spike protein again with stronger side effects or more robust and rapid immune response. However, response to these vaccines is incredibly variable. I've actually been trying to pay close attention to this and ask my colleagues. I have received both doses of the vaccine and found them to be incredibly mild. I had almost no symptoms, just some minor arm soreness for a day or two. With the first dose, in fact, just a transient headache that resolved, and with the second dose, even fewer side effects than the first, whereas the studies implied that side effects could be increased with the second dose than the first. So everyone's experience is incredibly different. My colleagues that I've asked about who had a known history of COVID-19 infection, they did not always have worse side effects with the vaccine as one might expect. So I think we can't really pigeonhole people into a specific response or reaction to these vaccines. But to answer the question specifically for immune compromised persons, the vaccines might be less effective in them. So really one should have a discussion with their the prescriber for the immune compromising medication about the timing of their immune suppressing medication and whether it might make sense to hold it before they receive the vaccination for a period of time.
The next question asks, does the 7 to 15% estimated rate of infection assume that tests are very close to the total number of cases? Recorded positives are already over 25 million, and I have seen other prediction models estimating in the 20 to 30% range.
So that's a really great question. In fact, I was just talking about this earlier today. This is not, unfortunately, an exact science. So you will see a range of estimates on how many people have actually been infected with COVID-19 in the United States. What we know is that at least 40% of people who are infected with COVID-19 have no symptoms at all. They're asymptomatic. So the only way we can even catch that infection is if they happen to be tested for another reason, either because they were exposed to someone who they knew to have COVID-19 infection and were told they needed to get tested through contact tracing, or they had a routine test because of travel or before a surgery, or because one was required through work. So we find people with COVID-19 infection who have no symptoms. Plus, when we think back to the beginning of the pandemic, we actually did not have enough tests. Testing hardly occurred in the first weeks of the pandemic because they were not available, they were incredibly restricted. So there were probably a fairly significant number of infections early on in the pandemic that were missed, that were never tested. But based on estimates of how many people get infected for every one person who has COVID-19 infection, as in how much virus transmission happens per case, given that estimate, and given the estimate of about the 40% asymptomatic positivity rate, and how many cases we've actually seen in the United States, the more than 25.5 million, when we then extrapolate that to the 331 million Americans that are in the US, we estimate that probably, even being generous, twice the number of actual cases that have been confirmed probably exist in reality. So there's probably at a minimum about 50 million people who have been infected. It may possibly be more than that, but we don't know. And we don't have a great way of assessing it because even antibody tests are not extremely sensitive and they're not very specific at testing whether or not someone has previously been exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and which is not why they're not, routinely recommended for establishing whether someone is immune. And also why it's not a definite that once you've had a COVID-19 vaccination, that you will have a positive antibody test, because not all antibody tests test for antibodies against the spike protein. So a very good question, and unfortunately there isn't a straight answer to it. But I think a good estimate is that probably we are somewhere around 7 to 15% of the US having been infected already. And again, if we're trying to achieve that 70% herd immunity to get to the end of this pandemic, we need multiple ways to get there. Natural infection is not a good strategy for a number of reasons. One, because it would lead to at least 4 to 11 million more deaths before we were able to achieve that number of natural infections. And two, because reinfection happens and immunity doesn't last. And three, because these genetic variants really effectively guarantee that we won't be able to stay protected from this virus forever.
Next question. Were there any studies or consideration around transplant patients, particularly kidney transplants?
So I can take that one to Dr. Patel. So unfortunately, similarly to other immunocompromised hosts, transplant recipients were excluded from the Pfizer and the Moderna trials. So we don't have any data specifically in them. But solid organ transplant is thought to be a risk factor for severe COVID-19 illness. So that should really be prompting a discussion between one's transplant physician and the patient to decide whether or not proceeding with vaccination is appropriate, because for all of these individual medical conditions, we know what COVID-19 infection can do. We think we might know what COVID-19 vaccination could do. So there's the known risk and there's the theoretical or the potential risk. And one just has to make this individual choice and balance, the unknown with the known. And the known is really not great for those chronic medical conditions that Dr. Patel mentioned.
We have a question related to if the vaccine is free to all, why is there so much emphasis on healthcare insurance in the appointment application?
So
Dr. Patel, do you want to take this?
yeah, I can take that. The reason for the insurance verification at the locations is that people will attempt to bill insurance whenever possible for the administration of the vaccine, but there's no cost for the vaccine itself. That's being provided by the federal government through funding from the federal government. But in order to try to support the infrastructure and the cost associated with actually administering the vaccine, the staff, the resources, the overhead, there's costs associated with that. And so if people do have insurance, they will utilize the insurance to try to get that cost for the administration itself. However, that cost should not go back to the patient themselves if it is not reimbursed by the insurance. But all insurances have said that they will reimburse the administration charge without an issue. However, if you are not insured or do not have insurance, that will not be a barrier to receiving the vaccine.
Okay. Next question, if you get vaccinated, can you still contract COVID?
So the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines have demonstrated a 95% efficacy overall for protecting against symptomatic COVID-19 infection. Now, the way they determined that number is they didn't routinely swab or test all clinical trial participants in the placebo and the vaccine groups for SARS-CoV-2 virus. Instead, if someone developed symptoms during the trial, they were then swabbed for COVID-19. And so they determined that compared to placebo, both of those two different vaccines were 95% effective at reducing one's risk of developing symptomatic COVID-19 infection. We don't really know yet, and we need more time to figure out if the vaccine can prevent transmission at all of the SARS-CoV-2 virus without the development of symptoms. And because of that, what Dr. Patel said is absolutely correct. We need to practice masking and social distancing until we learn more about these vaccines and whether it's possible for one to harbor the virus in their nasopharynx and transmit it to other non-vaccinated or unprotected persons because they might not be developing any symptoms from harboring the infection themselves, but they might be capable of transmitting it to other people. And because the way these trials were designed, we don't yet know that answer. So if people can carry the virus to other people after they've been vaccinated. Now, the vaccines were 95% effective at stopping one from developing symptomatic COVID-19 infection, but there's a 5% chance that you might develop symptomatic COVID-19 infection. But importantly, no patients died from COVID-19 after having received the vaccine who developed COVID-19 infection. And there was an extreme reduction in the severity of COVID-19 infection. So those very few people who did contract COVID-19 infection after having been vaccinated had very mild cases that did not require hospitalization or lead to death. So that's why this vaccination is so important, because it may turn the SARS-CoV-2 virus into just a cold, something that is not as deadly or detrimental to the way we live our lives, the way we interact in our communities, and the way our healthcare system functions.
The next question is, will our primary care from Sturdy Memorial Associates notify us when we can get vaccinated?
I can take that. Yeah, so we will be providing information via email communication, text messaging, and primary care offices will contact patients as well as they become eligible through the phases, and also once we have been allotted vaccine to be able to distribute to patients.
This question is about the components of the vaccine, namely, are they different for each?
So are we able to share that slide again, Chelsea, or I can just mention it?
Yeah, I can bring it up.
So we did address this in the talk, but I can specifically mention again. The Pfizer vaccine contains 30 micrograms of the mRNA, including the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, and Moderna is 100 micrograms of the mRNA encoding the spike protein. They both have the lipid nanoparticle that encases that mRNA and protects it from degradation. and they both contain polyethylene glycol. The reason polyethylene glycol is important to mention is because in those very few people who have had anaphylactic reactions to COVID-19 vaccination, that's the leading suspect for what might be the trigger. And polyethylene glycol is a component in many vaccines and injectable therapies, which is why that recommendation exists, that if one has a history of anaphylaxis to a previous vaccine or an injectable, why they should not receive the COVID-19 vaccine either. But the rest of those minor components really, unless you know that you have an allergy to one of them, there really is truly no other contraindication to receiving the vaccine.
Okay. The next question is related to the percentage of individuals infected with COVID-19. How many are asymptomatic?
So about 40% of people who have COVID-19 infection have no symptoms.
The next question is related to what happens after June. February to April, we know that there's going to be vaccination for phase 2, and then April moving forward is phase 3 general public. This individual wants to know, is the vaccine going to be in effect for how long, and will we need to take it once in our life, or will we need to take it every certain time?
$1 million question. So as I mentioned during the talk, we unfortunately don't know the answer to that. And there are so many factors that will impact, how many doses we need to receive, if this will be a seasonal or an annual vaccine that we need, similar to others in our lives, like the influenza vaccine. So from what we know about the neutralizing antibody titers, or the sheer amount of neutralizing antibodies that are triggered by these vaccines, they are large and they are protective for probably at least a year, but that may change with the emergence of these new genetic variants for SARS-CoV-2. So we may, in order to overcome these variants, it's certainly conceivable that we might need an extra dose or booster dose of these vaccines that I cannot comment on yet, because there's too much that needs to be learned about these variants, and also new variants could emerge at any time. But the great news about the mRNA technology that is behind these two vaccines is that it can be very easily adjusted to tweak or to change the mRNA that's contained in the vaccine, so that we will have more protection with a booster dose. I think the question was what happens after June. So one population of people that is noticeably absent from the Massachusetts phased schedule are children. So right now, we do not have any clinical trials yet performed in kids under 16. They are enrolling, they're not even, they have not yet started. So we won't know about children probably until 2022. That's the current estimate about when vaccination might be available for children. But between June and December, really, we're just going to continue to vaccinate as many people as possible. The Biden administration's goal is to vaccinate 100 million Americans in the first 100 days of his presidency. And right now, about 1 million people are being vaccinated per day. So it's just sheer trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible to get ahead of the circulation of these new variants, because the sooner we get people vaccinated, the better chance we have to prevent, widespread of genetic variants.
Okay. There is a question, Dr. Patel, I don't know if you can answer this, related to the La Salette location. Do we know if La Salette Shrine is a location for mass vaccinations?
So I believe the city of Attleboro is doing a small clinic at the La Salette Shrine, but I don't know that it's a continuous clinic. It's based again on availability of vaccine that the city of Attleboro receives.
Okay. And another question related to this: do we have any realistic timeline as to when we may receive vaccine for community vaccination?
So we do receive surveys on a weekly basis from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. where we can put in requests for vaccine, and we have both Sturdy Memorial Associates and the hospital have been putting in those requests. I believe right now a significant amount of vaccine is being allocated to the mass vaccination sites such as Gillette and Fenway, and now also to some of the local pharmacy areas as well. And so my understanding is that's where they're prioritizing distribution of the vaccine, but we continue to request it and are planning for the clinics once we do receive it.
Okay. If you cannot get the second vaccination in either the 21 or 28-day time frame due to lack of supply or availability of appointments, will you need to begin the process of vaccination over?
The short answer to that is no. The long answer is the recommendation, because of how these vaccines were actually studied, is that the Pfizer vaccine is administered with 21 days between the two doses and the Moderna vaccine with 28 days between the two doses. There are reasons why people might have to delay their second dose, either because they develop COVID-19 infection around the time of their second dose, or still recovering from or on isolation from COVID-19 infection, or develop another illness or some kind of extenuating circumstance comes up. Obviously, we want to avoid that as much as possible because we want to stick with the guidance reflected by the way these vaccines were tested as much as possible. However, from what we know of other vaccines and how the immune system is stimulated by vaccines, there should be no reason why someone would need to completely start over the vaccine schedule if their second dose is delayed. Right now, there's a grace period or a window period that's considered acceptable of delay for the second dose of about between 4 and 7 days. Obviously, I'm not trying to advertise this because we don't want people to think that they can, just cancel their appointment on a whim. You should absolutely be trying to get this vaccine, the second dose, when you're scheduled to do it, because if you do not, the risk is also that, the people who provide these vaccines, the vaccination sites, they have to be aware of how many people are coming each day, because these vaccine vials have to be thawed, and we do not want to run any risk of wasting doses because people don't show up. They cannot be put back into the freezer once they've been thawed. So we really need people to really try their best to come to their appointment when they're scheduled, but with as much advance notice as they can have, definitely before the day of vaccination. If they know that they're going to need to delay the second dose, they need to communicate that with the vaccination site so that we don't have any wasted doses.
We have another question. If I'm a Sturdy resident, if I'm a Rhode Island resident but a Sturdy patient, where should I be receiving my vaccine?
So you can, once we do have clinics available, you're always welcome to receive your vaccine through the Sturdy system. However, you can still receive it in Rhode Island if you're able to get it sooner in Rhode Island. It just depends on whichever one you can get sooner. It's fine to do either.
Okay. We have a question related to some news reports that COVID-19 vaccines can cause infertility. Can you speak to that?
So I can speak to that. So the news reports are actually based on commentary from a former Pfizer employee who's no longer employed by Pfizer, but has circulated this concern that the antigen created by the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, which is the spike protein that stimulates an immune response, is structurally similar to another protein in women's bodies, which is called syncytin-1, that's necessary for placental attachment. And he posited that the antibodies that are triggered by COVID-19 vaccination could have the potential to attack this syncytin-1 protein and make it hard for the placenta to attach and lead to infertility. This has been actually completely debunked, and I can go through that in detail as to how, but of course, this is a serious concern that a lot of people have, and my hope really is to allay some of these fears based on the data that we know. So what we do know is that the human body, in response to natural COVID-19 infection, makes its own large supply of antibodies targeting the spike protein already. And we also know that there have been many people throughout the world who have been pregnant who developed pregnancy after having COVID-19 infection, and there have been no instances of infertility found through natural COVID-19 infection, either during with loss of pregnancy or afterwards, where people were found to have new cases of infertility. Now, in terms of the vaccination itself, there's no data that antibodies produced by COVID-19 infection actually even target syncytin 1. Syncytin 1, this placental protein, and the spike protein, as I mentioned, are not the same structure. And also there were pregnant women who were studied not intentionally in the Pfizer and the Moderna studies. So there were 11 pregnant women who received the Pfizer vaccine, and there were 6 pregnant women who received the Moderna vaccine, and there were no adverse outcomes with those pregnancies observed in those trials. And also, as I mentioned, the natural infection has not led to concerns about pregnancy loss. The only outcomes that we've seen with pregnant women with natural COVID-19 infection, that really is why they're placed in the high-risk category, is because they have higher rates of preterm birth, higher rates of requiring hospitalization, particularly ICU admission, and they have had higher rates of death observed, but nothing related to actual pregnancy outcome or defects for the unborn child. Now, there are also, the COVID-19 vaccines were also studied in rats, and they found that there was no difference in female reproduction, fetal or embryonal development, or postnatal development in rats who received the COVID-19 vaccination.
Okay. We have one question that's specific here, indicating that I've sent a message previously about the allergy to polyethylene glycol. It's a 23-year-old reaction by a body rash, and it was determined that was more than likely the cause. My doctor suggested an EpiPen. Not sure that is something I should consider. Sounds a bit risky as well. Do you have any thoughts?
Dr. Patel, do you want to take that one?
So the polyethylene glycol is a component of the COVID-19 vaccine. So if you've had a severe allergic reaction to that component of the vaccine, then you should not receive the COVID-19 vaccination.
We're going to try and wrap it up. We're at the 7:45 mark, but there's a few questions related to whether or not anybody should be taking Tylenol or ibuprofen both before vaccine administration and after to help alleviate symptoms.
So I can take that one. There have been studies in children and whether or not pre-medication with Tylenol or ibuprofen impacts the efficacy of the vaccines that they receive, and actually suggested that it might reduce the immune response that's triggered by the vaccine, which is the intended goal here, is that we're trying to let our immune system respond to the vaccine and make antibodies and be primed and prepped so that if we're exposed to the true infection or the natural infection later in life, that we have as robust as possible an immune response ready to go. So the current recommendation based on that concern from studies in children, and by studies in children, I do not mean specifically for the COVID-19 infection, but for other childhood immunizations. It is not recommended to pre-medicate oneself with NSAIDs like ibuprofen or Tylenol before receiving the vaccine. But if you do experience side effects that are very uncomfortable, it is certainly okay to take Tylenol or ibuprofen to try to help, particularly if you do develop a high fever, which is not common, or significant pain in your arm, which is also not common. Try your best to tough out the symptoms if you can, but if you have intolerable symptoms, Tylenol or ibuprofen are fine, except if you are pregnant, in which case ibuprofen would not be recommended and Tylenol would be the treatment of choice for COVID-19 vaccination side effects.
One of the last questions that we have here is related to masking. If you receive the vaccine and the individuals that you are hanging out with have also received vaccination, do you all still need to continue to mask up?
I can take that. I think at this point I would say that it's safest to continue consistent social distancing and masking practice. You never know who is around who, and the risk of asymptomatic transmission still exists. And so I think that it remains recommended that you continue all of the infection control processes that are in place currently.
So I can add to that too. So obviously the goal and the hope of vaccination is that it will be our ticket to getting back to as normal a life as possible for all of us. And we will get there eventually. But until we make more progress on this pandemic and we see the number of infections and hospitalizations and deaths go down significantly, and until we know a little bit more about the vaccination and its impact on the potential for transmission of virus in asymptomatic individuals post-vaccination, the guidance is unchanged, as Dr. Patel said, but it will eventually change. Certainly, we're not going to be wearing masks for the rest of our lives, and certainly, eventually, we will, with vaccination, get to a place in this pandemic where we can be, with family and friends again. We're just not there yet. But we will get there, the more people that receive the vaccine.
Okay, I think that is going to wrap up this evening. We have been recording this meeting, so we will identify the best channel to put this meeting on. We will also be utilizing our website, our social media channels to keep you all updated with regards to vaccine supply as it may become available to us. Your primary care physicians, if it becomes available, will also be reaching out to individuals who are eligible in the various phases. And in the meantime, continue to stay up to date with those sites that may become available at mass.gov and utilize your primary care physician for any questions that are specific to your medical conditions and vaccination. Thank you, Dr. Fine and Dr. Patel, for your time this evening. It was very informative, and we've received a lot of great feedback on the chat indicating that they've appreciated this. So thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye.